Okay, so let's see how this video goes. I've still got my dodgy Movember tash. I apologise for that. And my voice might sound a bit creaky. I was out last night and yesterday, actually all day, and I actually needed help. I needed to be almost carried to bed last night. Actually feeling pretty good this morning on the back of that. But I was just discussing something on Twitter with regard to trans identities, and I wanted to try and scope it out using my son's chalkboard, as much for my benefit as anybody else, but I thought it might be of interest to other people to try and outline my thoughts on this. So this is with regard to who we regard as trans and who we don't. And there's a bit of a discussion taking place, often involving people who are trans themselves, as to what constitutes transness, and whether, obviously you've got some people who transition male to female, female to male, in other words, their trans identity, they're not very good terms, but their trans identity goes from what we would regard as an identity that we traditionally associate with biological males under the label man, and they transition to what we would regard as a label traditionally associated with biological females, women identities, if you like, and they will do most of the things they can to associate and to express themselves in that way, putting makeup on, having surgery done, various different things, okay, changing their hairstyle into a more traditionally a hairstyle would more traditionally associate with females, at least in our society. But then you have other people who describe themselves as non-gender binary, which includes a range of identities. And the question some of these trans people themselves are asking is, well, does that constitute, if you transition from man to non-gender binary or from woman to non-gender binary, is that trans? And some of them are saying, no, we don't regard that as trans. Others are saying, well, yes, it's trans, but you have to differentiate between that and somebody who has transitioned from male to female or female to male. I use those terms loosely. I don't like those terms, but you know what I mean. And I've several times now thrown another spanner in those works and said, well, if the case is that you're transitioning from one identity to another, why can't you transition from one typically male identity to another? Take somebody like Stone Cold Steve Austin. I always seem to give as an example as a particularly sort of hyper-aggressive masculine guy. If he became a much more effeminate guy, that would be quite a transition. He might still regard himself as a man, but that could be quite a transition. So why isn't he regarded as trans then? Or why wouldn't he be under those circumstances? I don't really see any reason that isn't just based upon the arbitrariness of the categorizations man and woman. So what I wanted to do is sort of draw it out to show you what I mean. So imagine here that these dots that I've already put on represent gender identities in a sort of gender space. Obviously this is a pretty poor way of doing it. It's only 2 dimensions. You need more than 2 dimensions, and that's all I've got, which is one more dimension than my personality, but probably not enough dimensions to sort of highlight this. So you'd have the sort of Stone Cold Steve Austin's. I'll just move the camera down a bit there. You'd have the Stone Cold Steve Austin's down here in this corner, and then a sort of hyper feminine girly equivalent up here, okay, and all these different identities and different ways of expressing and all these kinds of things, right? So imagine you map it out like that. And a transition could mean a manner of things. It could be sort of, that would be a transition. That would be a transition. Let's have a look. That would be a transition, right? And the way that I'm sort of outlining it there, the bigger the distance of the arrow, the greater the transition, the more change that has taken place within you. But it's a bit strange if that would class as trans and maybe some of these others wouldn't. And yet what we actually do is we sort of take a whole load of categorizations like, say, this, and we say woman, And then we take another slew of gender identities like this, and we say man, right? And here's the rub, is that man and woman are not just one tiny little discrete gender identity. You see these lists of like 50 non-gender binary identities now, and it's kind of ludicrous because actually there's such a huge swathe of fucking things that constitutes being a woman or being a man, so much variety. And yet the idea that you need one discrete label for all these tiny little variations is odd. But here's the thing, is that what some people are happy to call that trans. Yeah, you've gone from identifying as a man to identifying as non-gender binary, so you're trans. But if you made a huge leap from one different type of person to another, your gender identity expression is expressed wildly differently, right? We could all see that. We could all say, wow, that person has really, really changed in the way that they're expressing their gender. You might not even be able to detect this. How can that not be trans? If that isn't trans, then really all you're boiling it down to is a question of the arbitrary boundaries of labels. And surely for it to mean anything, it's got to mean more than just what word you choose to adopt for yourself. Clearly this one is, right? This is about lots of things, because this is usually about people who have transitioned, and this person will go to great lengths, not just to identify as a woman, but to try and reconfigure their body into that which we would regard as approximating biological femaleness. So that's a huge change. This could be a very, very tiny change. That obviously isn't going to be as huge a change as that, but in many ways it could be a much huger change than that. Okay, interested to know what you think about this. I'm not really interested if all you want to say is, well, man is biological male and woman is biological female. I don't have a problem with anybody making that argument, but this isn't the time to make that argument. This argument is made in the context of being on board with gender identity being differentiated from biological sex. And so if you want to involve yourself in this discussion, then even if that isn't a hat that you wear, you need to put that hat on for the basis of this discussion. But interested to know what people think. Okay, thank you for watching, and I think I probably ought to get something to eat.